Hi, and thank you for coming today. We appreciate you having you here. My name is Stephanie LaRue, and I am the Associate Director at CSREA, the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America. CSREA is an interdisciplinary hub that aims to build community with the public and among scholars and students working on race and ethnicity in and around the United States. We invite you to learn more about our programming on our website, www.brown.edu/race. Today's event, Patricia Rubertone, Native Providence Memory, Community, and Survivance in the Northeast, is a book talk by Professor of Anthropology at Brown University, Dr. Patricia E. Rubertone. This is the second of a four-part series known as the New Book Talk series that's taking place this semester, which highlights new and notable works that help us better understand how we study, research, and engage with questions of race, ethnicity, and indigeneity. Our host this afternoon is Dr. Robert Prucell, James Manning Professor of Anthropology and Director of the Hafen-Refer Museum at Brown University. At this time, I'd like to invite Professor Prucell to introduce our guest. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Before I introduce Professor Rubertone, I'd like to say a few words about land acknowledgements. As some of you may know, Brown does not currently have an official statement. The Land Acknowledgement Working Group, appointed by President Paxson, is working on developing such a statement. So what I thought I would do is share with you what we've posted on the Native American and Indigenous Studies website. So this is the statement. In our efforts to create a meaningful acknowledgement of the Indigenous peoples and their connections to the land that Brown occupies, NACI and others at the university are following a protocol to carefully consider what this acknowledgement should be according to Indigenous peoples connected to this place. We will work in consultation with the local tribes to determine what statement, if any, and actions can best acknowledge the tribal connections to this land that was occupied long before the university or the state of Rhode Island existed. It's now my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Pat Rubertone. Pat is a professor of anthropology and a faculty associate at the Hafen-Refer Museum of Anthropology here at Brown. She's a distinguished historical archaeologist who specializes in the study of colonialism, historical landscapes, and urbanism in native New England. Her work represents the best of interdisciplinary scholarship, combining the fields of archaeology, history, anthropology, and others to offer new insights and perspectives. What makes her work distinctive, however, is her humanistic outlook, her deep commitment to tracing out the lives and experiences of Native American people. In addition to her new book, Native Providence, Memory, Community, and Survivance in the Native Northeast, which we're discussing today, she's also published two other books, Archaeologies of Placemaking, Monuments, Memories, and Engagement in Native North America, and Grave Undertakings, The Archaeology of Roger Williams and the Narragansett Indians. In many ways, these three books mark a natural progression from the study of memory and memorials to social networks and urban homelands.
By golly, 'twas an Indian, was the headline of a story in the Providence Evening Bulletin on March 30th, 1943. The story reported that an Indian wearing beaded trousers and moccasins and carrying a tomahawk had been seen walking down North Main Street by the public relations officer of Rhode Island's Wartime Council of Defense. When he told his coworkers and friends what he had seen, they didn't believe him until a high school student wrote to the newspaper and said, the Indian coming along North Main Street last Saturday was Chief Sunset on his way to Rhode Island School of Design's action class, where he went through some characteristic motions for the students' benefit. He said the chief was rather old, but still agile enough to perform a traditional dance for the students' benefit, complete with war hoops. The chief was Edward Michael. He was not a phantom. He had lived in Providence for almost 60 years, and yet as an Indian, he was not supposed to be there. Dressed in full regalia and carrying a tomahawk, he fulfilled European Americans broad cultural expectations of what an Indian looked like in the distant past, but clashed with modern surroundings. Even more incredulous, not only was he an Indian, but he was a real Narragansett too, according to the story, and he was. What made this more incredulous is that Native people called by that name had been declared extinct by the Rhode Island General Assembly for almost as long, if not longer, than Edward Michael had resided in Providence. Simply stated, he could not be Indian and modern. To be both was contradictory. To be urban as well was even more incongruous, because it confounded expectations about being Indian and about cities. Throughout the Northeast, the most rapidly urbanizing section of the United States by the mid-19th century, urban histories rarely mentioned living Indians. They might appear in the annals of the early colonists as welcoming the newcomers. They then disappear in colonialist narratives, talking about their inevitable decline. They occasionally reappear in anecdotes and interviews, and sometimes as archaeological evidence that was unearthed during construction as urban development accelerated. They might come again into view in accounts of Native people who moved to US cities after World War II because of Bureau of Indian Affairs relocation programs aimed at assimilating them into urban life. Consequently, what is said about Native people in cities in the Northeast from urban histories is very little. They're barely seen, and their histories are vastly undertold. As apexes of physical, social, and cultural transformations set in motion by English settler colonialism, cities represent the modernity that indigenous people were denied. Yet they were very much, woven into modern cities, much more than has been acknowledged by the minor roles that were relegated to them. Dispossessed from the land Northeast cities were built upon, except for ancestral places that they tenaciously held onto, many carved new spaces for themselves and their families in these emerging urban landscapes. Providence, a compact waterfront town established on traditional Narragansett lands in the 17th century, experienced unprecedented growth during the 19th century, both from foreign immigration and migration from surrounding hinterlands. Within the stream of rural urban migrants from the countryside to the city were Native people whose participation in this diaspora was barely acknowledged. Most came from communities in southern New England whose tribal status had been terminated in the late 1860s to 1880. As a result, tribal members faced the uncertainties of US citizenship. Many moved to the region's towns and cities to find work and start new lives. Some of them, decades before their legal status as members of an Indian tribe was taken away and their reserved lands divided into individual allotments or sold outright. Taking different routes to Providence from their ancestral homelands, they reconfigured the social and geographical boundaries of New England Indian country beyond tribal reserves and the countryside. In Providence, they created what I call urban homelands. These were places of long and enduring residence where they were joined together by family, work, and a sense of community based on shared experiences, while continuing to be linked to people and places they had left behind. Urban homelands were not ethnically homogeneous, but instead were localities with a visible native presence, underobserved by history writers and official record keepers that defied their effacement from the spaces of urban history. Now, the idea for writing this book grew out of research that I had done on monuments that European Americans in New England erected to commemorate Indigenous disappearance. Often Native people attended the dedication ceremonies, and some unveiled these monuments. I suspected that their presence was intended to refute claims that they were extinct and to acknowledge the continuing importance of places on the landscape that were important to them, on lands that had been dispossessed from them. Now, some of the Native people who attended these dedication exercises were identified in newspapers that covered these events. Their names also appeared in the programs of the dedication exercises. The program for the dedication of a monument in North Burial Ground, it was a monument to Canonicus, a very important 17th century Narragansett sachem, mentioned the names of a Narragansett man and a little girl. Their last names were familiar to me, and after doing some cursory research, I learned that they lived in neighborhoods close to the monument site. Now, if there were two, were there still other Native people who called Providence their home in the late 19th and early 20th centuries? Besides wanting to know who these people were, I wanted to learn about their lives on the reasoning that there is not or has there ever been a single urban Indian experience, but many. The term urban Indian is grossly misleading. Someone is indigenous regardless of where they live. I wanted to know what their stories of survivance were. Survivance is a term that Gerald Weisenor uses to describe an active sense of presence over absence, deracination, and oblivion. So where were these people born? Did they move to the city from other ancestral homelands throughout the region and possibly beyond? If so, what routes did they take? How did they find each other and make the city a new place of belonging filled with its own memories? Did they travel between the city and where they had come from to visit family and friends in order to maintain connections within an existing web of relationships? Did they return to their tribal reserves when life on balance seemed less precarious, somewhere else than where they were currently living? Did some travel within a broader indigenous world for other reasons? What were the possibilities of reframing the history of settler colonial Providence through Native experiences? In Native Providence, I write about these experiences during the 19th, pretty much from about the mid-19th century into the early decades of the 20th century. Rather than simply challenging assumptions about their absence by identifying them, which was no small feat, I wanted to write about them in ways that were deeply human, intimate, and richly textured. I wanted to foreground the lives of ordinary people and not just highly visible individuals who gained international and national recognition in sports or the arts. I take the position that all Native lives matter. To write about them however difficult that task might be, is to value them. Their lives mattered and still do today to their descendants and should for everyone else. My goal in constructing these detailed accounts that showcase their life experiences and hopefully render emotions palpable, while also attending to the empirical evidence, was to disturb and dislocate urban histories. Admittedly, extracting identities and emotion from terse documents, at least most of them, wasn't easy. What can be said about the most marginalized and seemingly inconsequential people in public records, nevertheless, seemed much more preferable to representing them as anonymous or not representing them at all. Donald Fixico, the author of The Urban Indian Experience in America, says that one of the most important challenges for researchers is identifying and locating Native people in cities. I could not agree more. Public transcripts of the testimony of Narragansetts during detribalization hearings in 1879 and 1880, a survey of Massachusetts Indians from 1861, and Narragansett Dawn, a monthly magazine packed with editorials, traditional stories, recipes, language lessons, and announcements of social events and milestones. That was in circulation in 1935 and 1936 and edited by Princess Redwing, a Narragansett Wampanoag woman, were useful in finding names that I could then search in other records. Among these records were federal and state censuses, records of births, deaths, and marriages, draft registration cards, and city directories. Without knowing at least some of the surnames, my work with these records would have been far less productive. I would have written a very short story instead of a 462-page book. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about federal censuses. They are notoriously flawed. Native Americans typically do not trust them because they set racial classification within changing predefined categories that generally misrepresented or miscounted them. Unlike today, when someone is counted as Native American, if that person identifies as one, how someone's racial identity was categorized in earlier censuses depended on the judgment and the perception of the enumerators. Native people who lived off of tribal reserves were more likely to have been ignored or misidentified because of white European American expectations that Indians only lived on reservations. Individuals whose appearance did not meet stereotypes of what an Indian should look like because of mixed African American and other parentage were especially vulnerable and might have been overlooked as Indian even more often than they were counted as such. The options were to assign race based on the assessment of the race of the mother or the father or some other subjective criteria. In the course of working with the census schedules, I noticed overwriting. I noticed that some racial labels, were crossed out. There were marginal comments, such as not sure, maybe, okay, that indicated that the enumerators were not always certain of the racial labels that they assigned. And as historically problematic as the term Indian is compared to a tribal name, it wasn't always an option for census takers. Categories such as colored, mulatto, black, and white were. Okay. Despite how Native people were labeled in the censuses and other public records, they were there. Some had been in Providence all along, and after settler colonists had taken most of their land to build the city. Others had moved there, their children and their children's children were born there, and generations were there. By the 1910 census, Providence ranked as one of the chief Indian residential cities in the United States. Boxes filled in census schedules, and basic facts noted in vital records might not seem to lend themselves to what actually happened in people's lives or what mattered. Yet simple facts of birth and death, names and the places of birth of a mother, a father, and other household members, and occupations, if they were recorded, can be revealing and were revealing. They show family ties and how families stayed intact from the places they came from and the places that they traveled to. They served it as a starting point for imagining, the pain of losing an infant or watching an older child die from an incurable disease, or the drudgery that Native women felt doing other people's laundry over vats of boiling water to make ends meet. Okay. Reclaiming urban indigenous history. As the historian Carl Thrush argues, is a performance in its own right. That requires some intuition and some specific imagining of what happened, but has typically left very little trace. So I had to imagine as best I could, what was it like to do day labor and search for menial work every day? To know that you were unwelcome on certain city streets unless you drove a wagon or worked in someone's house as a laundress. What did it feel like if your paintings were not be shown in an art gallery unless you agreed not to attend the opening or mingle with guests at a preview? Okay. For many people, Providence had become, Native people, Providence had become their home. Even if it was paved with sidewalks crossed by streetcar lines, overshadowed with tall buildings, filled with the smells of smoke, rotting garbage, and the sounds of forging hammers, and crowded with strangers. The deaths of adults taken too soon and those of infants and children whose shortened lives represented the unfulfilled promise of Native futurity were heart-wrenching to read about, even in matter-of-fact public documents that admitted so many of the painful details. More importantly, I wanted to situate Native people's experiences, their struggles, their resistances, and their hopes within the spaces that they created for themselves in Providence. Cities, from the earliest towns and urban centers, excavated by archaeologists, are made up of neighborhoods that exist in the ground as well as in people's collective imaginations. Compared to Providence as a whole, neighborhoods provided a lens into their everyday social lives and individual experiences. And it's for this reason that I organized my book around the city's indigenous homelands. These homelands each had their own spatial and social history. By focusing on the homelands, it brought to light how Native people were intertwined into urban life, how individuals and families made these places their homes in ways that challenged the idea that if Native people lived in cities at all, they were scattered across the urban landscape. Or to borrow a term from the urban sociologist Mitchell Dunier, they were unhoused. Okay. So locating Providence's Native residents was, if not more difficult than identifying them. Street addresses were important to what I wanted to do, but street addresses were generally not recorded before the middle of the 19th century, sometimes even later. Streets were renamed, houses were renumbered. Okay, locations of some addresses simply could not be plotted, but the majority of them could. And their distribution on the Providence landscape revealed discrete clusters. May I have the next slide, please? So these were, if you could see these symbols, they represent discrete clusters of addresses, of structures that were 1 and 2 family homes, triple deckers, and tenements. Okay, these were their urban homelands. Okay, this map is very different than many of the maps that were published of Providence in the 19th and early 20th centuries. For example, there were these bird's eye views that were imaginary overheads of the city long before there was aerial photography. And these maps were meant to educate. They were meant to assimilate the newly arrived. But they left out much of what people needed to get around in the urban landscape. They wouldn't have provided Native people with information about homes that might have served as safe havens when they were adjusting to urban life or had fallen on hard times. Or would they have shown, areas where rents were cheap and the landlords, not half bad? They wouldn't have pinpointed, businesses that were looking to hire on a steady basis. They wouldn't have necessarily shown ponds when there were still good fishing, or places that were off limits for socializing. Okay. Indigenous people would have had their own maps. These were unpublished and not necessarily drawn on paper, but their maps would have been guides to everyday living in a landscape that in many ways no longer belonged to them. The map that I just showed you, the map of Providence's native homelands, approximates an indigenous map of city. It approximates it imperfectly. It helps visualize the places where Native people lived, worked, worshiped, mingled, but stops short of revealing what went on inside of the houses, courtrooms, jail cells, livery stables, checkers parlors, and beauty salons. Okay. Now, each of these urban homelands, Fox Point, Lippitt Hill, Upper South Providence, Lower South Providence, Federal Hill, Mashapog Pond, and Johnston, is the subject of a different chapter. And I used these terms because they correspond with neighborhoods identified on current maps of Providence. And I thought that would be helpful to draw attention to the deeper indigenous histories of these neighborhoods. The content of each chapter involved recounting the lives of Native people who lived in these homelands. And it also demanded that I, grapple with still other sources of evidence. At major archives, I combed through deeds, wills, probates, petitions, court records, maritime laws, newspapers, and the occasional, diary. I worked in institutions with less comprehensive holdings that are usually off the beaten track of most research itineraries. These are small town libraries, for example, local historical societies, tribal and anthropological museums, municipal agencies, and special collections held by colleges and universities. And at some of these places, I examined archaeological collections, accession records, technical reports, planning documents, and even plant specimens. At others, I sifted through uncatalogued newspaper clippings, announcements, letters, and various miscellaneous information. And I have to admit that at times the task hardly seemed worth the effort. You're presented with this large box, none of it is cataloged, and you have to sit there, going through this material. But it was at those moments that the words of the anthropologist Michel Roth-Triot about how power operates in the making and recording of history kept me going. Before recent calls for decolonizing research practices, he suggested that researchers need to study more than orthodox sources and accounts by professional historians. They should also look at the work of artisans of different kinds, paid or unrecognized field laborers who augment, deflect, and reorganized the former's work. The payoffs were unexpected insights into Native lives and webs of relationships, and also into archival practices that reinforce the separation of Indigenous from modern history. In widening the evidentiary scope of my work even further, I turn to sources of knowledge that exist beyond the holdings of various archives, libraries, and museums. Members of descendant communities generously shared their memories and family albums with me. Their perspectives of what was and is meaningful in their lives compensated for the silences in the colonizers' written histories and the terseness of their statistical reports. The photographs that I was privileged to see showed family members dressed in regalia, but also in everyday clothing, and formal dress, for parties, and weddings. The photographs showed Native people in candid shots, as well as in posed ones. Okay, the black and white prints that I saw, faded reproductions of newsprint, often brought back memories that gave me an intimate window into the subjects' lives, family values, and their engagements with the modern world. Visits to places that I wrote about was integral to what I wanted to accomplish in writing the book. Okay, how could I have written about Native Providence without getting a sense of what these Native homelands were like in the 19th and 20th centuries. Now, for anthropologists, field work that engages with place is central to their research. It gives insights that no archives, big or small, can in isolation. My travels across the city were to get a sense of these streetscapes, okay, where Native people lived. But I also got a very clear sense of how these spaces have been re-envisioned and repurposed in acts of erasure that inflicted additional harm on urban histories. I visited as many houses as I could. Some were still standing with their 19th and early 20th century facades, relatively intact. You know, others had been remodeled with storm doors and storm windows and vinyl siding. Others were boarded up, awaiting gentrification. The majority of them had been demolished by urban renewal and highway construction, by ongoing processes of destruction that had swept away old buildings, even good ones, to make room for new ones. In the Lippitt Hill homeland, for most of you, that's in the area where the University Heights apartment and shopping complex currently is. When I went to that area to, find some streets and houses, they weren't there because they had been eliminated in the early 1960s by this redevelopment project. Houses were demolished. Some of the houses that were demolished were still filled with furniture and boxes of personal possessions. In Upper South Providence, in the vicinity, to orient you, of classical and central high schools, that high modernist educational complex replaced homes, destroyed churches, next slide, churches that were as much places of worship as they were places where Native people from different tribal nations met to discuss social, cultural, and political issues. Okay, I circled around downtown looking for a church where an important Native activist had preached, only to find an empty lot. At Mashapaug Pond, there was a sign. This is at the west end of Providence. A sign written in English, Spanish, and Cambodian, warned against fishing in its polluted waters. Of a very vibrant pond that had sustained a flourishing indigenous homeland since at least the 17th century. And later threatened its well-being because of toxic chemicals that were discharged by the Gorham Manufacturing Company that stood on its northeastern edge from the 1890s to about 1990. An industrial park on the other end of the pond inflicted additional damage, obliterating part of a community that was in place and where elements of a traditional lifestyle of planting, collecting, trapping, and hunting persisted much longer than in other urban ponds, most of which had been filled by the turn of the 20th century, if not earlier. Now, toggling together different strands of evidence, archival, material, and oral, helped, uncover these experiences that were ignored, of Native people that were ignored in urban histories of Providence. The on-ground evidence I found to be especially important in providing an advantage to how these homelands had been targets of spatial erasure that existed, that had persisted in homelands that had persisted long after the expropriation of land for town building. I couldn't get a sense of the destruction, of its scale, simply by reading redevelopment plans, okay? They did not convey the scope of the violent physical and environmental alterations to the city's native homelands. Oftentimes, Native people are not mentioned in discussions of the racialization of urban geographies and its impacts on communities of color. The narrative estrangement of Indigenous people, from modernity, made them invisible victims of later urban development. They had not been pushed off the land that became Providence as easily as written urban histories suggest. They were still there, and they were not spared from further colonialist insults. The urban spaces where they lived continued to be invaded. In the 19th and 20th centuries, urban renewal, highway construction, and environmental pollution replaced war and enslavement as tactics of elimination. So regrettably, Native people were not considered to have occupied the homes that urban developers, planners, and engineers targeted as expendable. Okay. The spatial erasure that I saw and read about, starting with riots in the city's North End in 1823 and 1831, that set the stage for a separate municipal government in 1832, a massive land clearance project on the Fox Point waterfront reinforced even more to me the need to map the city's homelands and to redeem the stories of the people who lived there. Now, collectively, the demolition that was caused by urban renewal might be viewed as a kind of final rite of passage into oblivion, in which the spatial layout was ruptured, walls collapsed, houses disappeared into rubble, identities that were held together in place were torn apart, and where residents with strong attachments to their homes and neighborhoods were dislodged. The anthropologist Anthony Wallace has suggested that when people, witness the destruction of their homes, that they might experience temporary paralysis, a condition described as one basically of shock or numbness. And after that initial shock, peoples respond in different ways. Often there's some resurgence or regeneration. Mindy Thompson Fullilove, a social psychiatrist who studies cities, has applied this concept to describe how African Americans might feel the disproportionate effects of urban renewal on their neighborhoods. I I think the thesis is also useful to thinking more broadly about Native peoples' responses to the loss of home because of ongoing European settler colonialism. Okay. Native people had made cities their home, which were supposed to be a final step in their elimination. But it was not, okay? Some people were full-time and long-term residents that made place-shifting journeys from tribal reserves and off-reservation homes, or had deeper roots in the city. They found each other along the waterfront, train tracks, busy intersections, narrow side streets, close to the residences of Providence's leading political, business, and social leaders. And they found each other in factory complexes and at urban ponds. Family ties were maintained in transit and within relocations in the city. Native people lived close to other family members. Extended kin often occupied the same house or apartment or were near neighbors. Whether their home was rented or owned, they stayed within a few blocks. Okay. They sometimes lived at the same address for years or decades at a time, suggesting a degree of residential stability not usually associated with native city living. They met at churches where they discussed citizenship and what it meant to them. They prepared at these meetings in churches for activism outside the church's walls. They gathered at powwow grounds and other venues throughout the city. They maintained relationships with individuals, families, and friends that still resided near their tribal reserves. Okay, some of them returned to the countryside, to their tribal reserves when the disappointments of urban life, became too intolerable for them, only to move back again because of economic opportunities or because their ties to native homelands were as strong, if not stronger, than those to their former reserves. Their attitudes toward Providence are thinly documented, but the choices that they made about where to live in the city, their decisions to return to the city after leaving willingly or unwillingly, as well as their interactions with each other and non-natives speak volumes about being indigenous in Providence. Okay. When their voices can be heard in an occasional memoir or diary, they comment on the city's sights and sounds that some said seemed more comforting than the desolation of the countryside. Okay. Those who left Providence to escape discrimination and demeaning jobs they were obliged to take expressed loneliness when they crossed waters and they crossed worlds to reach far from places. The city's native homelands tugged on them. The native people that I write about in ways that provide, or at least I hope provide, character-rich semi-biographical accounts. And talk about, their disappointments, satisfactions, doubts, and every emotion in between. We're an important part, are an important part of this book. It was an important part of this landscape that belonged to them as much, if not more, than anyone else. If I have a few more moments, I'd like to just read a few brief excerpts from the book that I hope accomplish, what I'm talking about in terms of getting at people's lived experiences and writing about them in ways that I said are character rich, that are filled with emotion. I'm going to talk first about Anstrus Nichols, who lived on Lower Thayer Street for about 50 years in a house that her husband purchased in 1829. As a widow, as a young widow, she held on to the house, raised a son and a daughter, sent them to school, paid for piano lessons for her daughter and gear that her son needed to be a proper coachman or hackman. Okay. The home life that Anstrus Nichols had tenaciously struggled to preserve in Fox Point would again be shattered when her daughter died. Harriet's death was a profound personal loss, as the death of any child would be to a parent, especially one preceded by the pain and suffering associated with a terminal illness. There was also another kind of emotional toll that Harriet's death took on Anstrus. Her death led to the loss of material things that Harriet had brought into the Thayer Street home they shared, that had to be sold to cover the cost of the funeral and other expenses. These things were not simply indices of Harriet's conspicuous consumption, but also spoke of her educational opportunities and professional achievements, and in no small way of Anstrus's parenting skills. Their sale took away material expressions, not only of family aspirations, but also these women's experiences in the home that had enabled and nurtured them. Having acted in ways that staunchly defied the mutedness of Native women and all women of color in 19th century America, Anstrus, alone, elderly, and in declining health, could no longer maintain or hold on to the home at 5 Thayer Street that had been such an integral part of her identity and survivance. In 1885, she finally left her Fox Point neighborhood, which records suggest she had rarely strayed from for any extended period of time. One more. Okay. Clarence Freeman was a Pequot Indian and was a checkers player who earned a reputation as the peerless player of Providence by defeating some of the great checkers players of his era. Okay. Understanding how Clarence Freeman reached the heights of fame and respect in the art of checkers became one of the best strategists requires some guesswork. Biographical sketches suggest that he learned to play a game similar to checkers using yellow and white kernels of corn and black and white beans as gaming pieces, as was the custom of his people when he was 7 years old and being raised by his maternal grandmother in Connecticut. More than pastimes, these games tested guile and fortitude, personal attributes that would have enabled Clarence Freeman's survivance. As a child of divorced parents whose marriage had ended on charges of intemperance and cruelty, and possibly adultery, he would have had to strategize ways to overcome insecurities and the dire prospects he faced coming from a broken home and demoralized family and being Native American and poor in 19th century New England. Okay, to sum up, I think of Native Providence as an unfinished story. Okay? There are people who I couldn't say too much about, whose names are included in an appendix. There are others that I possibly missed. And like all urban or other histories, there are uncertainties in the cultural translations of past lives that I've sketched. My sincere hope is that this book and the stories in them open up spaces for telling still other stories. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. What I plan to do is to ask you a few questions, but I really want to open this up for conversation to the audience. I know there's some people in the audience that would very much like to follow up on your presentation. I just wanted to make a couple of comments to start with, which it seems to me that this book is really remarkable on a number of accounts. It's one of the first, if not the first, book to foreground the lives and stories of Native people in a New England city. And so I'd like to ask you about your inspirations. I know there have been studies of Native people in unlikely places, to use a phrase that has been used by other scholars and yourself as well. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mentioned Carl Thrush in the course of my presentation. He wrote this wonderful book called Native Seattle that was inspirational. So was his more recent book on Indigenous London that explores the experiences of Indigenous people in an overseas imperial city. Philip Deloria's book, Indians in Unexpected Places, that questions expectations about Native Americans in modernity and argues for readjusting the sight lines, the lineaments of modernity to understand how Native people made their way within structures that worked against them. Also had an impact on my work. And not in the least, the research done by our late colleague, Bill Simmons, on the persistence of oral narratives among New England tribes, and Keith Basso's ideas about placemaking as an ongoing process. Both of these scholars' work were instrumental to thinking about how urban landscapes are constantly being imbued with new meanings.
Thank you so much, Pat. Let me ask you about your cover. It's so striking. And can you describe the mural for those that don't know its history and its multiple meanings, and explain how you chose it for your cover?
Okay, the mural was created by Gaia, who is a Baltimore-based, internationally renowned artist, and particularly a muralist. And he worked in collaboration with the Paquot Museum. And the mural is, it's on an east-facing wall of 32 Custom House Street, right off of Dyer Street. And the artist, Gaia, reached out to the Native community in planning the design. As a highly visible piece of public art, it broadcasts the message that Native people are still, here. In fact, that's the title of the work. And it shows Lincia Montari, who's a member of the Narragansett tribal nation and an educator at the Paquot Museum. And she's shown holding a photograph of the late Princess Redwing, who was a Narragansett, as I mentioned her, Narragansett Wampanoag woman. She was an educator, she was a historian, she was the editor of Narragansett Dawn, She was an activist, and she was the founder of the museum. In the background of these two, the images of these two women are flowers, particularly sunflowers, which are motifs that appear in the art of Eastern woodlands, native cultures. I think what's interesting about the mural as well is Lencia is depicted in color, and Princess Redwing is in this black and white photograph that she's holding. And I think the juxtaposition of the color and the black and white, the younger woman and the older women, reinforces this link between past and present.
Thank you so much. That's really wonderful. I want to ask you a little bit about your scholarship and the multiple lines of evidence that you draw together: census records, court documents, newspapers, all of this. But you just mentioned plant specimens. So I want to ask you about how you use plant specimens in your research.
Okay, good question. I talk about plant specimens when I discuss Sarah Baxter, who was described as an Indian doctress. She was born in Nantucket. Very little is known about her. Practically nothing is known other than that about her early life. But she lived in Providence. She rented a house and probably as a small outbuilding that served as her laboratory, where she prepared herbal medicines using traditional recipes, and she marketed these medicines both locally in Providence and also in southeastern Massachusetts. Okay. And in the early stages of the book project, I delivered a paper at a professional conference about Sarah Baxter and her medicine making, the marketing, her entrepreneurial skills. And someone came up to me at the end of the session and said, I don't really get it. Where would she have gotten the plants, to make this medicine? You're talking about a city. Well, the fact is that plants that have medicinal properties even grow in cracks in the sidewalk. Okay. There were some empty lots around where she lived as well that could have had plants that had medicinal values. But I felt I had to take that a step further. So I did some research at the Brown University Herbarium, and their plant collections basically span from the kind of 1820s to the 1920s. So it was a really good, temporal fit for the research that I was doing on native Providence and on Sarah Baxter. So lo and behold, some of the plants that appear in these recipes for native medicine, pharmacopoeia that have been passed down through the generations, some of these plants were available, definitely available near where she lived and not too far away at other localities within the city.
Thank you, Pat. That's an incredible story about a line of evidence that you pursued. One of the most important contributions is your appendix, where you list 341 Native people in your 7 neighborhoods. And I recognize names such as Noka, Perry, Thomas, Whedon, Wilcox, all of which are represented by notable Native families today. Let me ask you a little bit about the reaction that some, I mean, I know you've interviewed people, worked with people, and David Weed has also asked this question. What sort of reaction have you gotten from the, people with respect to your book project now that it's out?
Well, COVID, as we all know, puts a limit on, face-to-face conversations. Real face-to-face conversations as opposed to virtual ones. So I'm hoping as we ease out of this pandemic, there will be more opportunities for some of those conversations. But I've heard, I've had phone conversations that followed up on the book. And one of the individuals who I worked with in the course of researching this book seemed pleased that I was able to connect what he called the dots that somehow contributed to telling the story of Native people's urbanity in the city, in a city that they called, and many still call, home today. I received comments about the images in the book. I made a concerted effort to show Native people in contemporary dress rather than regalia. And that also seemed to have struck a chord. One person said, that he wished there were more images in the book. I do too. Unfortunately, I had to work within the publisher's guidelines. The information on streets and street addresses where family members and friends lived were sometimes, vaguely known. You forget addresses everywhere folks lived. So providing that specific information about these different residential, moves within the city also seemed to be of interest. And with one of my, my interlocutors, to use that word, we did a driving tour of Providence's native homelands on the east side. And this really brought, out this surge of memories about growing up in the area. So, as I mentioned, I hope that the appendix, as well as the map, will open up, ongoing conversations.
Pat, I've always been fascinated by the Indian Council of New England. And it was founded, I believe you say, in 1923, and it seems to be an early and maybe one of the first pan-Indian benevolent organizations, predating the National Congress for the American Indian by some 21 years. And you give a nice account in your book of some of its early meetings at the Pond Street Church, Roger Williams Park Museum, and the Masonic Temple. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Can you share a little bit more about that?
About the organization?
How many,
sure.
And the photograph that you used to illustrate it was really in front of the Pond Street Church was really, I know some of those individuals are known and have been identified, but maybe not all of them.
Okay, the organization was in existence for about 2 years, 1923 to 1925. Okay, it was founded by Thomas Bicknell, who is an antiquarian and an educator. And basically the organization by that name stopped operating when he died in 1925. But it continued to operate under the name of the National Algonquian Indian Council. And let's see, some individuals who had been members of the Indian Council of New England even broke away from this new group, the group that was called the National Algonquian Indian Council. And, you know, there are a number of different reasons why. I think some felt that the organization had accomplished, you know, its goal of encouraging a cultural resurgence and bolstering tribal pride. But this National Algonquian Indian Council did continue to hold, they were biannual, you know, meetings. Later on, they were reduced to yearly meetings. You know, that would involve a powwow, a gathering with dances and, you know, demonstrations of different skills, but also a business meeting. Okay. And, you know, part of the of what these organizations, these intertribal organizations that had non-native members, part of their goal was recruitment. Okay, so each new member who joined, you know, was asked, you know, are there more Native people who you know who might be interested in joining our club?
Thank you so much, Pat. I'd like now to turn to some of the questions that have been submitted. And let me start with Sylvia Ann Suarez's question about early Native American artists. And Sylvia also says that she performs Nancy Elizabeth Prophet. Mm-hmm. So she knows about her, and you might want to share that with the rest of the community here. Who was Nancy Elizabeth Prophet?
Nancy Elizabeth Prophet was born in Warwick, moved to Providence, I believe, you know, I think after she got married, she was living on Benefit Street with her widowed father. She attended the Rhode Island School of Design. She was studying painting, right? In the talk I mentioned, you know, that someone was asked not to attend the reception that accompanied, you know, the showing of her paintings, not to mingle with the guests. That was Nancy Elizabeth Prophet. She was so discouraged by this that she decided to leave Providence. She sailed to France. She relocated to Paris, where she continued to study art and turned from painting to sculpting.
Do any of her artwork survive? Do we have?
Yes. RISD has, I know they at least have one of her pieces. There was a showing of some of her wooden busts and marble bust at the Providence Public Library back in the late 1940s. And that was her father's. One of the first opportunities he had to actually see, you know, her artwork. Wow. She had sent him photographs of her art, and on the back sometimes wrote, you know, "This is for you, Dad." But the visit to the Providence Public Library was the first time he actually saw these pieces.
Wow. Let me ask a question from our colleague, Jessa Lineweaver. She wants to know a little bit more about the objects that had to be sold to pay for the funeral. And related to this, could you say a few more words about the sources that were the richest for your project, beyond the first one that you mentioned, which was about finding surnames?
Okay, let me start with the first part of the question. I think that's in reference to the excerpt I read about Anstrus Nichols.
I think so.
Correct. Her daughter was a music teacher, and we have a probate inventory, of her possessions that had to be sold to cover the cost of her funeral. There were music stands, music books, a guitar, satin, silk dresses, and capes. She lived a very different lifestyle than her mother, who took in wash to make ends meet. Right. So these possessions that the dresses, the musical instruments, the music stands, she brought them to her mother's house. Harriet had divorced. She moved back, right, to her natal home. And those things became a part of this homestead. It became a part of this house on 5 Benefit Street. But when Harriet died, she died of cancer, there wasn't enough money, to pay her funeral expenses. So many of these objects were sold. Is there another part to the question?
Oh, just talking about the which sources were the richest ones besides the names of individuals?
Okay. Let me think about this for a minute. I mentioned the detribalization hearings, the transcripts of those events, this 1861 census and Narragansett dawn. I cull those records to get names.
Mm-hmm.
In addition, the wills and probates. There weren't that many probates, but the few, these are inventories of personal possessions, were incredibly, helpful and rich to get insights into, almost a snapshot of a person's home. Nancy Elizabeth Prophet left a diary that covered a few of the years that she lived in Providence. So that was incredibly, helpful in terms of getting a sense. She lived a life of a struggling artist. She was starving, most of the time. The flats, the apartments where she lived, were cold, they were damp. But she had this, tenacity to, pursue her art career, and she's recognized. She's very successful at that. There's also a deathbed confession. And deathbed confessions are a little strange because you don't know if it's actually the person talking or that person that's talking through the voice of the jailer. But one of those concerned an Amasa, his name is Amasa Walmsley, who was publicly executed in Providence for a murder that he might have committed and might not have committed.
Wow. Well, we're almost at time. If there is one question that I will bring to your attention, but I know that it's a hard one to answer, which has to do with Jamila Medina would like to know how to learn Narragansett. So I thought we are interested in revitalizing languages, and so maybe it would be worth saying a few words about that.
Yeah, I think I would contact Lorenz Spears at the Tomaquag Museum.
Yeah.
All right. I know that Loren and members of her family, and I'm sure there are other Narragansett who, know the language that's been passed on, over the years. But I know Loren is interested in language revitalization programs, much in the same way as other, indigenous groups in New England and beyond.
Well, on that note, I think we should call the meeting to a close. Thank you so much, Pat, for presenting your book to us and providing more detail and explaining how it came about, the work that you did. It's just so impressive, and I'm just amazed at it myself. So thank you so much for sharing it with us tonight.
Well, thank you, Bob, for moderating. And again, thanks to the entire team at CSREA. And thank you, all of you who I can't see, who sat in on this book talk. Thank you very much.
Take care, everybody.